Welcome to Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, a podcast by Chefalo Consulting, where we share the knowledge, stories, and resources you need to create a trauma-informed culture that supports wellness, growth, and resilience. I'm your host, Shenandoah Chefalo. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you joining us on the podcast today. Today, we have an amazing guest. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Amelia Franck Meyer, who is not only a longtime friend of mine personally, but is an influential pioneer in reimagining the child welfare system to become a more nurturing and supportive future. As the founder and CEO of Alia, Amelia has dedicated nearly 3 decades to transforming care for children and families affected by trauma. Her leadership has spearheaded innovations like the Youth Connection Scale, the Well-Being Indicator Tool for Youth. We can talk about many of the other things she has stuck her hands into to make big changes in this nation. But beyond her professional accolades, Amelia is a keynote speaker and a beacon of inspiration, advocating for systems that ensure children thrive in the loving care of families. Today, Amelia joins us to share her profound insights into building organizational well-being and integrating a cadence of rest into our daily lives to foster healthier, more resilient communities. Amelia, I'm so glad to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming.
It's so good to see you, Shen. Thanks for the invitation.
Before we start about all the amazing work that you're doing with Alia, and partially part of the reason I get to do the podcast is to get updates from friends and hear about all the new things going on. But tell us maybe, if you will, a little bit about what drew you into child welfare in the first place, or maybe there's a moment or experience from your early career that sort of you knew this is what I'm meant to do.
Well, there's just a lot of moments, I think, in all of our lives that bring us to this work. And then there's, a rating of other experiences. I don't have one single aha moment where I knew this is how I should spend my career, my life force. But I grew up in a family that had very little. And so we were very connected. And I learned in my 20s that my dad had endured really a very challenging childhood that I knew nothing about growing up, but it explains so much about the experience he tried so hard to give us and being a cycle breaker that he was. And then, early in my career, I thought I wanted to be a therapist, like a marriage therapist or parent-child therapist. And my first job was in group home. And I got to see what it was like to be with children who were separated from their families, who really needed a mom and dad and instead had shift staff. And I just found myself trying to create family-like environments that were never really quite what kids needed, but yet they were able to go home on the weekends and their parents could parent them. And that just made zero sense to me. So I think some of those early experiences really influenced my deep and lasting belief that families belong together.
I love that. So tell us how you came to start Alia and what was kind of the inspiration behind that and your goal with what you're doing at Alia now.
Yeah, I was working on a graduate certificate at the University of Minnesota. They called it a Permanency and Adoption Competency Certificate. After 9 months of class and learning and being exposed to different things, we did these case consultation presentations of sorts. And, I watched all my classmates do it, and I had my own many stories. And to be really honest, they all started to sound very similar. And I felt like, oh my goodness, we could write a book here on 1,000 ways to screw up a kid's life. And they seem to all end up in the same place. But that made me really clear, like, this is not a child problem. This is not a child and family problem. This is really a systems problem. And we got really good at the organization I was at before here at getting kids out of care back to permanency, like 83% of the time back to legal permanency for kids who they said could never live safely with a family. And we did that in a lot of places with a lot of kids, but it was really clear that there were drivers putting all these kids in this situation. And I got to the point where I felt like I can't keep doing this one child, one family at a time, although that is incredibly important work. And God bless the people who do it. I needed to get to one system at a time, right? And so asked my board of this treatment foster care agency to help me launch a totally separate new organization that really looked at the systemic factors that were leading to these individual outcomes and launched Alia. We officially incorporated in 2015, but started doing the work there in 2016.
I met you shortly after Alia launched. So, talk about 10 of 10 for kids, if you will, and kind of what was your thought behind that? And then I'm probably more intrigued with what maybe some people would call the failure of it, but what I would call the success of it, and how those conversations led to kind of where you guys are today.
We launched with really just the speaking revenue I had from going around helping other people understand how to get kids out of care back to their families. So it wasn't very much. It was me and my assistant and a fundraiser. And then we eventually added a couple more staff in the first year. But, we were real clear we weren't going to reform child welfare or foster care with a small group of us in a one room office. And so at the time, I was studying in my doctoral program at USC an innovation class and learning about IDEO and human centered design. And also in 2015, I was awarded a Bush Fellowship from the Bush Foundation, which is not beer, beans, or politics, as they would say. It's 3M money. And I was at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And basically, from sunup to sundown, there were all these people talking about how to solve population level problems. And so kind of brought together that idea of human centered design and really big thinkers and decided we were going to do this 10 of 10 for kids, which was the idea of bringing 100 innovators together, designers together from 10 different groups. So there were 10 people from federal and tribal child welfare, 10 from state, 10 from county. We said 10 child experts like therapists and principals and judges and 10 people in philanthropy. And we said at the time, before people were really talking about this, 10 folks with lived expertise. But it turned out to be closer to 30 to 40% because, as you know, folks are also running organizations and counties who have had experience in the system and so on. I won't go on, but 10 groups of 10, one of each kind at each of the 10 tables with a facilitator from our local design community and or from IDEO. And we asked the question, how might we build a better child welfare system? We got 30 different prototypes, coded 450 pieces of information, including the prototypes to say, what do they all have in common? Called those ideas this concept of unsystem, and unsystem, meaning we don't know what it will be called in the future, family and child well-being system, whether prevention system, whatever. Semantics don't matter. The idea is that we would unravel the bureaucracy in the system closer to people who know what they need. And so then we set out to build that idea in real life and ran a 4-state, 14-county innovation cohort that had some amazing outcomes as they tried to build that out. Washington County, Maryland reduced the number of kids in care by 70%. And Clare, Wisconsin dropped the number of kids in residential by 54%. Waupaca County dropped more than 70%, got down to 0 kids in residential care at one point. And so we worked with a number of Eastern Service Region of Iowa, 10 counties. They had 96% of their kids who did a child safety conference did not come into care. And so really amazing outcomes by shifting mindset, and that shifted what people did in practice.
I think we got to give listeners a pause for those numbers because you're talking about 70, 80, 90% reduction. It's a voting year. People are talking about, well, it's unsafe, right? It's unsafe for kids to leave kids in these places, but safety came up in our cohort, as we know, many of times. It's a word we've talked about a lot, Amelia. But in all of these cases, we also saw that kids might have been more safe staying where they were, right?
Yeah, there was no degradation of the safety outcomes, right? So kids were as safe or safer in all of those places. And I'll just say, Shen, we started in 2016, did 10 of 10 in 2017, which is where I met you. And then you were a guide in our cohort. So we've been hanging out together trying to work on this business for a while. And so you're really well aware of how that went. And I mean, I think the other thing is we have to look at the data on safety because it's an emotional response. And of course, we all want kids to be safe, and that makes sense in our heads. Like, they have to be safe. But study after study show that when kids come out of their family home and are placed in care, a full 30% of them, a third of them are re-victimized in care. And that only counts the adult to child abuse. It doesn't count the child to child abuse, which is rampant.
And it only accounts for reported abuse as well, because we know unreported abuse is skyrocketing as well.
That's correct. We cannot, with any kind of integrity, say that kids are safer when we remove them from their families. And of course, there are situations that are just clear to every one of us. We're not talking about the kinds of cases that make the front page of the newspaper. We're talking about the vastly 83% of reports nationally that have nothing to do with physical or sexual abuse, but are really more the impact of poverty, of trauma, and of bias. So there's lots to do where we can keep families safely together and kids are safer in that situation. The last thing I'll add is that, it also only counts the physical abuse because 100% of them have emotional trauma from family separation, 100%. And so, it depends what you're looking at and what you measure, but there aren't measures that say that there's a case here and there where something tragic and horrible happens. Overall, when you look at the data, we cannot honestly say that kids are safer when we put them in out of home care.
I think just from my own personal experience, it's the thing that when people ask me to talk, they have the hardest time wrapping their minds around is this idea that being removed from the situation that I was in, regardless of how severe my situation was, to the unknown was really more traumatic for me. When I tell people that the unknown, the not knowing, I knew how to survive my previous situation. I'd been doing it my whole life. I actually didn't know another way, right? It was so ingrained. And people really struggle with understanding how unsafe and how much more my behaviors escalated because I felt unsafe as well, right? And so then the focus became about my bad, naughty behaviors and not understanding the link to those behaviors to what was happening in the environment around me. And just seeing those behaviors as only the things that came from my biological family system, not the new environment I was placed in.
That is the story. And that's the piece when I say like the story started to sound similarly. It's like the behaviors manifest differently, their experiences are different, but it all ends up in the same place where kids did not feel safer.
So, one of the things that we've talked about a lot, and you kind of talked about it with the IDEO and the human centered design, and probably the buzzword now, as people are like, yeah, 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 trauma, 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 is that now you hear people talking about human centered organizations or human centered workplaces. And I know you talk about this a lot too. And what does that actually mean? For me, when I decided to tell my story and to start doing this work, like you, I was like, I wanted to go further and further upstream, right? I find myself now circling back around again. But I realized pretty early that yes, child welfare was connected to a lot of the things I cared about: incarceration rates, kids not graduating from high school, teen pregnancy, substance abuse. And then that led me, of course, to understanding adverse childhood experiences. And then that led me to start thinking about the systems piece that I didn't think a lot of people were talking about 15 or 20 years ago. And I still sometimes don't feel, which was the people inside the systems also had stuff, not just the families and kids that they were trying to help, but the people in the systems themselves had their own unhealed trauma, had their own unhealed things. So the work they were doing was traumatizing, plus their own stuff that hadn't been resolved. I know that you've been talking about this. So, how do you see that piece of organizational well being? And what does that look like, Amelia, when we're not just saying self care as a buzzword, but when we're actually practicing organizational well being as well? How are you guys tackling that in the work that you're doing?
Well, you just have talked about so many things. So I'm going to set aside the human centered design, co design part of this, and I'm going to focus in on this last piece. Well, they kind of come together in my answer, I guess. Two-thirds of the US population has at least one childhood trauma. And the research on it is that if you're attracted to this work and you're doing this work, it's probably more like 70 to 90%. And so, that's just for me, it's a universal precaution. You just normalize that, assume everybody's got something. I really don't know anybody who had the perfect childhood because we're raised by humans who are imperfect. I mean, I teach trauma informed parenting, and it's really good that my moments with my children are not on video because I would be quickly disqualified. We all just are doing our best. I kind of joke sometimes that as long as they need less therapy than I did, I'm calling it a success.
If my kid's ACE score is less than my ACE score, that's my bar.
It's another way to measure, like, we're doing our best and we're all human. And so, yes, there is the combination, and there's so much to say here. I mean, we really could do a series on this alone. So, people coming in with their own historical and familial individual trauma, then being traumatized in a secondary traumatic way by what they witness and see, and then being also having the traumatic experience of doing a job that most systems have on average a 40% vacancy right now, some higher. So doing a really impossible job. But then I'm going to add too, there's a new kind of trauma that I think is leading to a moral injury in our workforce where people are not leaving their jobs. They are, in fact, leaving the field because they're learning the current research. They're learning what kids and families need. And then they go into environments where they know what they should be doing and they cannot do it. And they know what families need or are asking for and they cannot deliver it because our systems are not yet caught up with the current evidence base. And our funding is tied to family separation, not to family healing or the understanding of the necessity for belonging for children. And so that's a really hard thing to ask people to do. And you see it all the time. It was last fall, I think, but in an unnamed state, one of the workers was like, I'm just not going to be part of re-traumatizing kids and families for you. I'm just not going to do that because they understand it better.
Well, it's malpractice. I mean, I think you and I started throwing the malpractice word around a long time is that it's one thing if you don't know better and you're just doing the best you can, to your point. I'm parenting one kid. It's the only kid I have. It's the best I can do, right? And when I learn something, I try to do something different. The problem we're facing now is the research is telling us we're doing the wrong thing. And there's some people who are gaining by continuing to do the wrong thing, though, too, which is there's money tied to this system.
Oh, of course there is. I mean, it's a $33 billion industry. And I mean, I literally will do a keynote on a new way of work and in building a new way of work alongside impacted families and letting them tell us what they need and then building and delivering that together with them involved in that. And we'll have someone come up afterwards and say, okay, I get it. I hear what you're saying, buying what you're selling. But I just have one question because if I did it that way, if I believed what you're saying, it would mean that my residential program would probably close. So, how am I supposed to square that? So, you're saying that you continually knowingly traumatize children because otherwise, you wouldn't have a job. And I'm not saying that I think there's this fantastic people doing this work with big old hearts. That's not the norm, what I've just said. Our systems aren't aligned to do the thing we know families need. That's just the bottom line. And so we're all in systems where the laws, policies, structures, rules, and funding line up for treatment and separation. They are not lined up for preservation and belonging.
And people first. Yeah, people first or belonging. In any kind of system, not just child welfare, by the way. We could be talking about education, we could be talking about the justice system. I mean, any large system in the United States, especially, is not human centered. It's about task and process over people. And what we're really talking about is how do we switch that? And what happens when you're in this nasty middle of some people want to do it better and some people never will want to come over to the new way.
I think most people do, though. I think it is moving in that direction, and I think most people do. And it takes a long time for systems to catch up. And so, what you find is people trying to be creative and doing it inside the current system. And frankly, a lot of our work has been helping people shift their mindsets because you watch the number of reentries, the number of substantiateds, the number of separations, the number of kids in care all drop without changing a single thing besides what people know and think about what kids need. Like really understanding it differently changes behavior, and you can get some real gains that way. We're never going to get all the way till the systems change too, but I feel like, there is work to do in helping people understand the change that has to happen, what kids and families really need. And I'll just say a word about that for a minute because there is a way that, we're doing this work that when we shift our hearts and minds, it does shift the outcomes and the behaviors. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be focusing on because when people don't understand why it's important, they're not willing to do the really hard work of making the changes necessary. And bringing this back to what you said about the people doing the work in the workforce, during in the height of COVID, we helped some of our child welfare partners who were on the coast who were building morgues in the parking lot, and we did some work with our local big health systems. We were working with VPs of nursing who had imprints on their face permanently from their masks from 14, 16-hour days. And I've never done such hard work in my life helping people to stay at a job when it was very challenging. And what we took away from that, what we learned from that really was that you can't do self-care in those moments. So there were no bubble baths, there were no walks, there was no sleep. People were literally fighting for their lives and others. And what we really took away was how do people do really impossible things and stay at it? And what we really walked away was the importance of having this sense of belonging, that these people were so tightly knitted as a team that they would not leave because they couldn't bear the thought of leaving their coworkers behind to deal with it. And so they leaned on each other and they built this incredible sense of belonging and connection. And when you think about it, it's really true for humans. Like we can do anything as long as we know we're not alone. You see, like the whole town of Paradise, California is burned to the ground, and people are holding each other in the street saying, we're going to rebuild together. But when you feel really alone, even the smallest thing can make you feel like never getting out of bed again.
That connection piece to me is so important in systems work because I think it's the piece that you can't really systematize, right? You can't systematize belonging. In other words, it's not a task to do, it's a way to be. So you can't put it on a checklist and say, everyone belongs here. It kind of comes from your pores, if you will, and you either belong or you don't. But the thing that I hear in organizations all the time is we're not safe. I don't fit in. I'm the squeaky wheel. I'm the person trying to do things differently. These are things that I hear all the time. And I spend so much time with leaders just saying, get to know each other. Are there trauma informed tools we can introduce you to? Yeah. Are there big tasks that you need to sometimes make amends for in systems because there's been big harms? But one of the best things is like, can you just pause and get to know each other? And there's this idea, it's why I wanted to talk to you about that cadence of rest, because there's everyone that you work with, everyone that I work with is doing important work. But this idea that everything is so urgent that we can't make time for each other, I think has overtaken us as a society, right? This idea that there's no time, Amelia, to sit down and have a cup of coffee because we got to get to 47 tasks and all the fires and emergencies that are happening in the midst of those fires. Then I feel like I can't trust you or depend on you because I don't even know you.
It's a parallel principle, which we see all the time in working with folks who've been impacted by the system along. And it's this principle that proximity builds empathy. And so the closer you are, the more you get it. It's why the workforce feels like the managers have no idea and they keep asking us to do these things and they don't understand the impact. It's why folks in the system think they know what families need, but they're not up close and they're not engaging or co-designing alongside families, and so they really don't. And so proximity, as you're talking about taking the time to be close and to learn about someone's experience and situation, it builds trust, it builds empathy, and there's really not a substitute for it. Talking about systematizing belonging, I do want to say a quick word because we have started to map out with a technology partner sort of these hubs of belonging in an organization and that are reported up by the team. So who do you trust the most? And then you can see and doing those things. And then to learn from the super connectors who people seem to go to who are usually not the people you expect. It's like, June in accounting who has bubble gum on her desk, but the super connectors and to bring together the super connectors and the disconnected and to talk about what are the strategies that work and don't work and how can we build these fibers of connection, this fabric of connection in organizations, because if we feel like we're in it alone, you're not going to last long. We have to hold on tight to each other to get it done. And frankly, in this world right now, that feels true in every place that we are. It feels like it's a buckle up buttercup moment here that you need to have someone and something to hold on to tight because it's a time of enormous shift and change and challenge.
Yeah, I love your connector. I've been doing this in schools that I work with for a while, is that we call it the eye chart in the schools that I work with, is that we put like every kid who's in that building's name like across the top of an Excel and every teacher down the other side. And we ask teachers to put dots next to kids' names that they have relationships with, right? And you begin to see kids who have no dots, which helps us kind of prioritize. And then we flip it and we ask kids, which is a little harder for teachers, by the way, because we ask kids to put dots next to teachers' names that they think that they would go to. And to your point, I think it helps us cross-reference, first off, just because a teacher thinks they have a relationship, is the kid reciprocating that same feeling? Because that gives us some good insight. And two, what happens if you have no teachers that kids have relationships with, right? And what does that say? And what's going on there and what's happening there? And so it brings in these new insights. But I think in teams, it's such a valuable thing of like, I say this all the time. Have you ever just sat down as a team and said, what do you need for safety? What do you need from us as colleagues? What does that even look like? And not at a time when something's going on. These are, for me, conversations you have when things are relatively in their normal phase. Just day to day, what do you need to be safe? How do we do those things? So, Amelia, how are you weaving this into this idea of organizational well-being into Alia? Because one of the things you and I talk about is it can be frustrating, and both of us have experiences at places where they talk a good game, but behind the scenes, they're not really doing the things they say out loud. So how are you weaving in some of these well-being principles into Alia? Because listen, you started as a small team, but every time I check your website, you've grown leaps and bounds. So you guys are definitely in a phase of growth. So how are you weaving this into your fabric there?
The truth is, we've experimented with a number of things. Our organization is in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I live in South Minneapolis, just 10 blocks from George Floyd Square. And so we were really deeply impacted by George Floyd, which, of course, happened during COVID. And there's just been a lot of turmoil in the child welfare field and shifts and changes and what COVID did to small businesses and nonprofits. It's been a really, really challenging few years. And so we have tried on a number of things. When it happened first with George Floyd and in early COVID, tried some things. So I'll tell you some of the things we tried and then what didn't work and then what we're doing now. We gave everybody on the team a stipend to retrofit their offices for homework and said, whatever that means, like you need a plant, you need a full spectrum lighting, you need a ergonomic chair. We gave people resources to make their place comfortable, a sign that says you're strong or you can do this or whatever that is for you. We gave people a gift card to buy something that brought them joy. And then we gave 3 extra days we called joy days. So it meant that you had to use it to do something that brought you joy. It wasn't just another day off, it was a joy day. So we had people who bought a blow up kayak and went out kayaking for the day or did something for themselves, went and got a massage that day or what have you. We were able to also give folks, when George Floyd's murder first happened, we had a lot of our team protesting. So they could bring water down to the protesters. They could spend the money. We asked them to spend it on a BIPOC owned business if they wanted, or to help in whatever way they wanted, in a way that advanced the cause of anti racism. We tried some things, some other things. When I say a cadence of rest, our work is so team focused that we tried this idea of how do we rest together? Because we work together, and then if you're gone and then I'm gone the next week, it's really hard. So, how do we rest together? So, we tried half day Fridays. They were moderately successful because once you log on, it's hard to log off. And so now we do 2 Fridays a month instead, all the whole day. And we just try to rest together. We ended up putting in a couple of weeks, one midsummer and one at the end of the year of agency closure. So we have a little less flexible vacation time and more cadence together of rest vacation time. We, during COVID, uncapped our vacation because people were losing it because they couldn't take it. So we did some of that. We extended our FMLA and sick policies. Like if you got COVID on the road, we were going to let you stay and we'd take care of you where you were so that people weren't worried about being stuck having to pay for a hotel for 10 days because they couldn't travel. So we take care of them there. We have started our meetings all at 10 after the hour, which we learned from our friends at IDEO because people will not end meetings early, but they will start them late. So that gave us time to get a drink of water, stand up and walk around. Because in the beginning, I don't know if you remember, but all day on Zoom was brutal. Our bodies and brains weren't ready for that. And people were jello by the end of the day. So we did some of those things. We bring people together more frequently for in person retreats. Those who are local, we try to get together in the office on particular days so that we can see human beings. And we have really focused ourselves on building a sense of belonging internally. We assign mentors to new people and, have work in teams more so that we build those interconnections in the organization. Lots of things like that. There's a whole bunch more, but we've had to kind of try some things and do other things. And what we're talking about now is co-designing some of these solutions because we have a lot of rest and then it's like, can you still get your work done with that much rest? And so some people are like, I need less rest. And some people say, I need more rest. And so, how might we come together and really practice our principles of co design that we do with our partners and solve for some of those things together?
So, first, thank you, because I think some of the things that our listeners probably struggle with is like, it sounds good, but give me the tangible, like, what can we actually do? So, there's 3,000 ideas in there, Amelia. But one thing I want to focus on, because I know this is a concern for a lot of leaders, and it's the one thing that I think you and Alia do so fabulously well, is that and some leaders and some organizations get nervous about this, is that when there's an event like George Floyd, for the example for you, which was so close to home physically for you as well, is that some employers don't know how to respond in those times. Is this too political? Is this really impacting my staff? Do we need to say anything? Don't we need to say anything? What should we do? What does that look like? And by the way, I'm not picking on it just because it's George Floyd and at the time it became the center of a lot of political debate, but these can be things I've seen in communities where there's a tornado or we've lost power for 3 days for a storm and employers don't recognize that either, right? Like it can be a myriad of things that are going on outside of the technical physical office. Do you have advice or thoughts for leaders in those situations? Because we know it's impacting people, but how can we help them work that into when they think about organizational well-being, even when it's something that's not organizational driven?
When I think about this, I think about where we struggled is, do we say something publicly? Is it everybody saying something, so you have to say something? Is it virtue signaling? Why are we saying it? Does it have integrity? So we really struggled with that part. But I think what we didn't struggle with was inside our organization, we talked about this. And it wasn't just George Floyd. There was a series of things that happened. There was a series of mass shootings and crimes against people of color and other individuals. And it just felt like you couldn't catch your breath. It just kept coming and coming for a while there. And folks are hesitant to talk about these things at work. But the truth is, that it was on the mind of all of our employees, and our employees of color were particularly suffering and not saying anything I think is just insult to injury. It's like when you lose someone, my daughter has a brain tumor, and it's like people being afraid to like ask about it, or it's like, no, it's on my mind all the time. You're not bringing it up for me. You provide relief when we talk about it because it's on my mind. I can say, here's how it is. So we have Asian staff. Remember the crimes that were happening against the Asian community and Pacific Islanders. And we just had to say a thing. And then we allowed people to have kind of cultural call-ins. After George Floyd, we kind of said call in while black, which basically meant you just call in because, like, I can't do it today. I need a whatever that day is, a mental health, a sick day. I don't care what you call it. Basically, it's so exhausting to be witnessing the violence to people who look like me over and over. Like, I just can't. And no explanation needed. We let people step off the train for a while. And we talked about it. We were doing anti racism work before then and are still doing it and imperfectly and all the things, but we still are talking about it because it just felt so disingenuous. Like it disappears people, like it's invisible. How can you not when, quite honestly, I'm not sure how people keep at it because of the relentless pieces of news around violence against communities. So, acknowledging, seeing people, allowing them grace and space, doing our level best, like providing resources or letting people step out, whatever that is, I think you just have to do a thing that feels genuine, authentic, and ask people what they need is another thing.
Amelia, as a leader, did you have fear when you started down that path? Were you worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or any apprehension?
I still do every day. Right now, I'm being recorded. It'll go out, and I'm thinking, oh, how do I talk about this? I think as white folks, I have learned so much on my own, but also from people who I'm with and who have been patient and gracious teachers and by mistakes I've made. And somebody just asked me if I was interested in doing a micro learning. We do these. And I said, yes. And the topic that's on my mind right now is safe and uncomfortable. And so part of the work in anti racism we've done is really, how did we get on this topic, Shen? And is really kind of left me with this idea that I'm almost always uncomfortable because when I'm comfortable, it means somebody else is uncomfortable. And so, who have I made uncomfortable so I can be comfortable? And I mean, that crosses so many boundaries and barriers. And that's what I want to talk about is it's a design principle in speaking of co-design, like that you are both safe and uncomfortable. And that's where the growing edge is in the discomfort. So you have to talk your body's trauma response down to say, my life is not at risk. It just feels like it is. I'm just uncomfortable. That's different than unsafe. It's different. And teaching yourself the difference so that you can sit in the discomfort. I'm just going to say one more word about this related to the kids and families who we work alongside. But the truth of it is, I think we're often afraid to do this really important change work. People are like, I worked too hard to get here to risk messing with the system. And as we talked about, all the people have something to gain from the status quo. And I was working with a system leader once, and I didn't remember this, but they recalled it to me recently. And we were talking about addressing racial disparities. And this particular leader was in an area where that might not have gone over well in the community to talk about racial equity or disparities or bias. And they were really worried about saying it out loud, naming that that was one of the goals. And this leader reported to me that I said, I know that that makes you uncomfortable, and I know it makes other people uncomfortable. But I wonder, and this leader said, we're just not ready. And I said, I hear you saying you're not ready, but I wonder if we ask the kids and families who are experiencing the harm of bias and disproportionality, who are experiencing the impact of racism on the separation and the harm to their family, do you think they're ready for you to do this? What would they say? Would they say they're ready? And my guess is they're ready. And why we're not ready is because we're too comfortable, because someone else is uncomfortable so we can be comfortable. And we got to get over that.
This piece of safe versus uncomfortable is a big one for me. And it's something I talk about in systems is that we often say we're unsafe, but really we're just uncomfortable and knowing the difference, right? Also, like, having something hard to say doesn't mean I'm unsafe just because I have something hard to say. Like, it's hard to tell somebody they have spinach in their teeth, but you should still tell them, right? Like, it's hard and we can still do hard things. But your story reminds me pretty early in my career, I was at a big national conference and a white woman came in to talk and she said, "Stand up if you would like to be treated like the people of color at your place of work." And nobody stood up, of course. And she said, "Oh, you must not have heard me. I said, stand up if you want to be treated like people of color at your work." And again, nobody stood up. And she said, "Oh, okay. So you know that they're treated differently, but you don't want to do anything about it." That's been something for me in my career that has stuck with me for a really, really long time, which is it's something that I struggle with as a person who's white identifying. And, I teach and train on structural violence and race trauma on a weekly basis. And I say this in all the groups that I do is like, I don't know if I'm the person who should be speaking or not the person who should be speaking. I will probably misstep in doing the work and I'm going to do it anyway. Like, that's kind of the place that I've come to is like, even in my mistakes, I'm going to keep doing the work and then please let me know and I'll own them. And then secondarily, right or wrong, I'll keep speaking it and we can just keep having the conversation until we figure it out. But to your point, I'm always going to be uncomfortable. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you're paying attention, you should be very uncomfortable.
And it's okay to be uncomfortable. But I think that ties into a bit of this wellness of like, you have to do some personal work to be okay being uncomfortable. That requires some personal work and owning that. And just in all full disclosure, some days I don't want to do the work.
Well, in full disclosure, here we are in our you've created an environment where it feels like it's just me and you. So I'm about to say something, but I mean, there are days where I feel like if there was an easier way, I'd want to take the easy way out. But I just know there's not. I know the only way out is through. And so I go through because if there was an easy off ramp and I could get the same result, I'm not proud to say I'd take it, but I know there's not. And other people can't choose an off ramp. Other people can't choose it. They're uncomfortable and have been forever and ever. That's why I'm saying it's just the way it is now. And I think that that is like the least we can do is pay attention and be uncomfortable.
Yeah, and create spaces. For me, I think it's let's just create a space where you can be safe and uncomfortable. And let's talk about it. And I've had some amazing experiences in those spaces. When someone's light bulb goes off, there's never, Amelia, you speak and facilitate like I do. When you see someone's light bulb go off, I mean, that's the thing that keeps me getting out of bed every day.
That's right. It is a rush. It is a rush. And then, I mean, the great thing about that is you can't unknow it. It just once it's on, it never turns off. You can't unknow. And so that I think it gives me a lot of hope in that way too, is that and then they help other people to see the same.
And I don't know about you, but I find sometimes the people in my trainings that push back the most are the ones that become the biggest believers.
Eventually. I have people who were cross-armed, promised they'd never speak to me, and are now evangelizing. It's deeply rewarding, and when that happens, it helps you to stay at it. But I think, the thing we haven't really talked about here that we have to tie in both the spaces of safe and uncomfortable, in both our anti-racism work and both our systems change work and in our trauma work is the role of shame here. And when you talk about the work that has to be done, so much of it is shame resilience that I can feel badly and not believe I am bad, right? That I can hear hard things, I can hear things that need to change and or ways that I've created harm where I didn't mean to or know I was and feel very badly about that and still stay in it to have the resilience to get back at it.
We talked a little bit about the self-care piece, and I know you brought up the bubble baths and all the things and the things that give you joy, but I also know you know that that's not real self-care, things that give us joy versus real self-care. Looking ahead, what do you think is gonna be the next evolution of organizational wellness? What do you see on the horizon coming on this? I hear a lot of people, especially in child welfare, Amelia, talking about workplace well-being, but what do you think they think that means, and what do you see as the next evolution of real workforce well-being?
Well, it's tied to something else I have to answer together. Is I think that we are going to see shrinking of systems, so a need for fewer people to do the work, different kind of people doing the work. So there'll be more integrity and more joy in the work because people will be able to do the work in a way that they know in their heart of hearts is actually helpful and why they got into the work. And they'll have to do less of the things that are soul crushing and that really take away from their joy and integrity. I think that'll be the case. We'll be able to offer support in community by community earlier and have less of really complex cases requiring a high level of clinical skill because we'll have fewer systemically traumatized folks. There's all these openings, which I think is kind of great because I don't think they actually need to be filled. And in systems where we're working, they've divested a lot of those resources and positions. And so there's that. That's one thing I think will happen. So the work will be more aligned with what we know needs to happen. So it will be more fulfilling and less depleting. So one is that. And just systems, I think, will be smaller. I don't think real change happens without the shrinking of the system, and community based networks of support will be stronger. And so families will have more agency to get help by people who look like them without risking losing their children and help earlier. So I think that will contribute quite a bit where people will feel like they're really doing the work they wanted to and needs to be done. So that's one thing. I think that this next generation of the workforce is not going to work themselves into an early grave. They're not going to die at their desk. And I think they think we're nuts for having done that. And so I think 4-day work weeks are closer than we think. I think work from home or flexible work environments are closer than we think. I think a richness of different kinds of benefits around exploration, volunteer, learning, in addition to rest. I think that people will find ways to have just more balance and mental health in the work by having more flexibility to take care of themselves. I think, I hope that whether it be AI or other integrations into our workplace, that the work will be less hard and that we'll be able to have assisted work that we can get done without as much mental drain and pain.
I think that hard piece, though, comes when I think it's less hard when we know we're doing the right thing.
100%. I have a picture in my office, which I'm not in right now. My husband took it during COVID, but it's in my office that says, they gave it to me for my birthday one year that says, the more you do the thing you love, the more energy you will have. So people sometimes ask me, like, how do you blah, blah, blah? And it's like, oh, you don't understand. Like, these things fill me, so I can do them all the day long. The things that drain me, I have limited capacity for, but they're different. It's like, how can you possibly go to school? It's like, I love it. I love learning. That doesn't drain me. But some other things really drain me. So you try to limit those.
So before we get to our quick fire questions, because we always like to end on quick fire questions, and I'm really thinking about leaders working with staff, especially in child welfare, but right now in schools, I'm doing a lot of work in court systems where folks are just emotionally fatigued. What is one, maybe two ideas you have, Amelia, that they could do this instant to buy them some space to think more intentionally about long-term change, but what could they do right now to boost staff morale in a place where everyone is emotionally fatigued?
I was going to give you an individual answer, and I still am, and then I'll think about staff morale. But what I was going to say is, I don't think we fully understand the level of grief we are all carrying around with us. And we really haven't put it anywhere. I mean, we lost 1 million people. And we all know someone who was permanently changed from COVID or that we lost in COVID or just in the state of the world. So I just came off a few weeks off for sabbatical. And one of the things I did, which I really haven't told too many people about, but I'm going to say here, is I made an appointment with an old therapist of mine. I asked him if I could just come see him and cry. I haven't cried. My daughter has a brain tumor. I haven't cried about it. I haven't cried about COVID. I haven't cried about the racial uprising. I haven't cried. And so I just made a list of everything that made me feel sad. And he said, I'm getting old. I'm retired. I think I can give you 2 hours and stay awake, but I don't think I can give you a whole day. And I said, well, I will try to get it in. So I just sat with him for 2 hours and I told him everything that I felt sad about. And I bawled my eyes out. And it was such a relief. Like all that gets stored in our body, Bessel van der Kolk's for real. Like the body keeps the score. So you have to discharge, whatever that is, kickbox, run, spit, kick, cry. But I did an intentional mindful discharge activity. Like, I don't want to hold this anymore. I'm putting it out. I'm getting rid of it. So that personally was incredibly uplifting and relieving to me.
It's probably the favorite tip I've heard so far, by the way. I love it.
It's quite personal, but it was so helpful. So, in an organization, I think that there are lots of things to do that people would think are the right thing to do in this case, but that are actually not restorative. And so I wonder about a collective process of like, what are we holding on to in our organization? Is there anything that we want to let go of? Is there anything we need to grieve? Is there something that we're every day carrying the backpack of things that need to be said that aren't said that we need to say? And so an offload, a grieving session, write it down and burn it up kind of thing. Put a shredder in the middle of the room. I've seen that done before. People write it on a piece of paper, everybody goes and shreds it. But I would say to think about what kind of discharge or offload activities might you do? Is there a truth you need to speak, a thing you need to say, a wound you need to heal with someone? That to me, those are the biggest energy sucks, is carrying the backpack of BS around. And if you can put any of that down, that's so much better than a few days off.
Okay, quick fire questions, Amelia. What's the latest book or show that's caught your attention? What media are you consuming that the rest of us should take a look at?
I just finished reading a book that was written by somebody I met at the Aspen Ideas Festival on grief, and I bought another book there on grief called The Amen Effect. And I know it's quick fire, but I want to tell you a quick thing about it. This is why I heard this rabbi talk, and she said that there's an ancient Jewish ritual in Jerusalem. You climb to the top of the mountain, and there's a beautiful arch, and people who are brokenhearted go to the left, so that 10 people go to the left who are just broken. And to the right are the 100,000 who feel like they can meet those people partway through going around the walk around the outside of the circle and look them in the eye and say, tell me what broke your heart, and offer blessings for healing. And so I went up afterwards and said to her, okay, that's so interesting. What if 100,000 go left and 10 go right? What if 100,000 are brokenhearted and only 10 feel like they have something left to give? Because that's how I feel the world is right now. And she said the most beautiful thing that has been on my mind. And she said, oh, Amelia, everyone is brokenhearted. Of course. You go left if you have nothing to give. If you are recently mourning, if you feel like you don't want to be alive, if you have nothing to give to the world. But if you have anything to give, you go right. And so maybe you are a grieving mother, but you're 3 months further into it and you can look back and help another mother behind you. If you have anything to give, you go right. And of course, we all have broken hearts, but there is enough left to give that we can help the few who are in deep in it and have nothing. So the Amen Effect is that book that I'm reading now.
If you could have dinner with any historical or contemporary leader, who would you choose and what question would you want to ask them?
There's so many, but this is what comes to mind. Like I could list 100, 200, but right now what came to mind immediately was Abraham Lincoln around the team of rivals. I just feel like we're in such a place of divisiveness, and he found ways to bring people together. Like I've been thinking about what would it be like if Kamala Harris picked a Republican for her running mate? Like crazy things like that right now. Like how do we find our way back to each other? How do we build trust together? And I think his team of rivals approach is so interesting for these times.
I think it's interesting that you picked him. I just had Dr. Sang-Hoon Yu on the show. He also picked Abraham Lincoln because we chatted just after the debates, and he said he wanted to ask him because both candidates at the time, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, had a picture of Abraham Lincoln hanging behind them. And he was just so curious what Abraham Lincoln would think about that. How about a hobby or activity that is consuming your time or you wish was consuming your time right now? Joy. What's your place of joy right now?
I just said to my husband, I have not done enough swimming this summer. I love to swim, and there's an app called Swimply that's like Airbnb for swimming pools, and I think I'm doing that this weekend. You just rent it for like an hour. It's no biggie. It's like, in your neighborhood. It's jumping in somebody else's pool, but with permission. And I always feel like you should know people that own cabins, boats, and pools, but you don't have to own them yourself. So swimming for sure.
You're invited to the lake anytime you wanna come, and the water is perfect for swimming right now, Amelia.
I know it is. I've been wanting to get myself back up there to Michigan in general. That's my happy place. So back at Warren Dunes, back in Lake Michigan.
The bed is available.
Well, I may take you up on it.
Any last notes you wanna leave our listeners? Or anything you want them to know about Alia, some great resource you have you wanna share, anything like that?
That's such an invitation and a generous one. I would say we have lots of free for download resources on our website. Part of our values are really abundantly and freely sharing what we do and what we learn. So I encourage you to go to aliainnovations.org, innovations with an S. But I think the summary of what I want to lay is like what we're about, what I'm about, what I think the world needs right now. I really do feel like there's such magic and healing in connecting with other humans. And so, what I want to leave you with is really like what needs to happen for you to get back to someone, to say a thing, to let go of a thing, or if there's someone who you just want to be more proximate to, you want to understand better, have built more depth or more trust. I feel like, friends, it is a time where we got to hold on tight to each other. And so, find yourself some people to hold on tight to. And if you already are joined hands with people, snuggle up a little closer because this is a bumpy ride, and the way we're going to make it through is by our deep and loving connections with each other. And on that note, Shen, thank you for having me, and I'm so glad for my connection with you.
I am super glad to have you in my circle. Thank you, Dr. Amelia Franck Meyer. We will have all the posts to the books that Amelia talked about, to a link to aliainnovations.org. I strongly encourage you, even if you're not in the child welfare arena, to check out the resources. They really can be applied anywhere. And Amelia, we hope you'll come again to be on the show, as it sounds there's many rabbit holes we could still dive down.
It's a danger when we get together, but anytime you invite, I'm going to accept.
I love it. For our listeners, remember, we just do this work one step at a time. Please take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment is brought to you by Chefalo Consulting. To learn more about Chefalo Consulting and our trauma-informed change management and professional development solutions, please visit chefaloconsulting.com. That's Chefalo, CHEFALO, consulting.com. Make sure you don't miss these transformative conversations by subscribing to Mindful Management wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for listening. And remember, change happens one step at a time.